Hi, I'm Stephen Wishnoff, and today is June 22nd, 2011. I'm here with Bruce Vilanch doing an interview for the Archive of American Television here in North Hollywood, California. And that's about it.
Okay. What was your name at birth?
My name at birth? What's that? My name at birth was Bruce Gerald Vilanch.
And when were you born?
I was born November 23rd, 1947, during a blizzard in New York, a legendary blizzard of 47. I was taken at 4 days old to New Jersey, where I was adopted. So that was the first insult of many. I was taken to Jersey. I was ripped from the heart of Manhattan.
And what is the name of the father who raised you?
Jonas Vilanch, O.D. He was an optometrist.
And your mother's name?
Henny, H-E-N-N-E, not Y. It was Henrietta, but she shortened it to Henny 100 years ago. But not to be confused with Henny Youngman, who was my mother also, but it's another story.
And what did Henny, your actual mother, do?
She was an actual mother, and she was also kind of a dancer. She never really did it professionally, but she did it in a bunch of shows in Jersey, and she loved show business. She had a tremendous affinity for it. She used to dance at a club that was run by Bill Miller. It was called Bill Miller's Riviera, and it was on the Palisades. And Bill Miller is the father of Jimmy Miller, who produced the Rolling Stones, and Judith Miller, the notorious New York Times reporter, who I kind of grew up with.
So you were raised into show business.
We were all raised in the show business. My mother also was a party coordinator, a party planner, a wedding planner, and she ran a business with Bill Lewis, who was a caterer, whose son is Richard Lewis, the comic, who I grew up with. So we were all a strange little unit.
So you were raised by some pretty interesting people. Did you ever have the opportunity or interest to meet your birth parents?
No. I was interested when I was about 13 because I was having the typical teenage angst. Where did I come from? I don't belong here. Who are you people? And they had told me I was adopted when I was younger, and so I decided that was why I was unhappy, because I wasn't, to their manner born. So at that point, I tried to find out, but I was too young. You couldn't find that stuff out in those days. And they said, come back when you're 21. So when I was 21, my father said, you're 21 now, and which I'm glad he could remind me, because I was terrible at math. And he said, you could go find out your parents. And I wasn't interested. And I remain uninterested. At this point, I figure that they're probably in a home somewhere if they're around.
Do you have any siblings?
No, I was an only child.
So what traits do you attribute to inheriting from your adoptive parents?
My mother has fabulous timing. And I think watching her, I picked up a lot of comic timing. Her whole family, that whole side of the family was very funny. In fact, one of them actually was a Catskill comic. His name was Mickey Landau, but he didn't go very far. My father's side of the family was very scientific, and doctors and professional people. So it was an interesting combination of the two. I guess it's kind of like show business.
Growing up, what interested you, activity-wise?
Show business. I was fascinated by the theater, the movies, TV. I learned to read by reading the ads in the paper, and spell things out from Virginia Mayo. I could read that early.
What television did you watch early on? I mean, what influenced you the most?
Oh, the fat guys. I loved Jackie Gleason, and I loved William Bendix, and who else? Well, not so much on television, but Zero Mostel, who was theater and film, and Wallace Beery in film. But the early TV stuff I loved was variety shows, because all of those fabulous performers were on them, on Ed Sullivan, and Steve Allen, who was the hip version of Ed Sullivan. I loved watching clowns. I was crazy for Joan Davis and Lucille Ball and Sid Caesar. those golden age people. I mean, I grew up. I was a kid in that golden age. I was watching all that stuff, all that live stuff that was coming out of New York in the 50s.
You watched all those funny people. When did you realize you made people laugh?
Early on, I would make faces in the mirror, and then if I was ever in a sticky situation, I would make a joke and they would laugh, and I could get out of it that way, or I could run away before they came at me with fists.
Did you spend time running away in high school? I mean, what high school did you go to?
I went to Eastside High School, Paterson, New Jersey, which is famous for the Morgan Freeman movie Lean on Me. That was my high school. After I left, the heavy drugs came in. You know, when I was there, we were just like rolling reefer. But then the heavy stuff, the airplane glue, and I mean, no, we did that too, come to think of it. It was the heavier stuff came in. And the school became famous because it was so out of control that the Board of Education hired a guy named Jolton Joe Clark who carried a baseball bat around. And that was the basis of the movie, Lean on Me, that Morgan Freeman was in. And it was a great school. I mean, Paterson was a strange town. It was a town that was dying on the vine, but it produced some very creative people: Allen Ginsberg, Lou Costello, and a lot of people wrote about it. Nelson Algren wrote about Paterson, William Carlos Williams, John Dos Passos, all wrote books about Paterson. Strange.
Were you involved in high school plays or musicals?
I was the head of the Dramat. That was the Dramatic Society. I was in a lot of plays, and I was a big man on campus because I was like a star, you know.
Going from big man on campus in high school, where did you go to college?
I went to The Ohio State University, where I showed up with Richard Lewis and Judith Miller and other people like that, and we took over Columbus, Ohio. And actually, I'd gone to private school in Jersey for a little bit before that, where I was very friendly with Leslie Gore, whose father was Maidenform Bras. Leslie Gore's father is in Maidenform Bras. We didn't tell anyone. But he financed her pop career. And so when we were still in high school, she was having pop hits, like It's My Party and all that. And Leslie's good friend was Lisa Hallaby, whose father ran Pan Am and was probably at the time the richest Arab in America. And he was so rich that she wound up becoming Queen Noor of Jordan. So it was an interesting crowd. And she didn't go to Ohio. She went to Jordan. But I was in Columbus, and I continued doing plays. Yeah, when you do plays in college, they all see you, and you kind of become this weird sort of mini-star.
Were you studying theater in college?
I studied journalism and theater. It was a 5-year stay-out-of-Vietnam program. Everybody had one. You'll notice that none of the major politicians who were my age were in Vietnam, with the exception of John Kerry. Everybody else figured out a way to avoid going. And 5 years was a way to avoid. I mean, you knew if you went, you'd be killed. So Vietnam is, I think it's no secret, the army in Vietnam was populated by kids from the underclass and the working class. And anybody who had any kind of connections figured out a way not to go. You know, whether you were in ROTC like Dan Quayle and George Bush, or you were a Rhodes Scholar like Bill Clinton, everybody figured out a way not to go.
Well, it seems natural that you studied some theater. Where did journalism come in?
My parents. My parents knew I loved acting, and all I ever wanted to do was act. And as a kid, I was in New York all the time, hanging around the theater and trying to get jobs. And I was a child actor, and I would get little things here and there. I was never a child star, or we'd be having this conversation in rehab. I was just, one of those. And they saw a train wreck ahead. They thought that I would never make a living as an actor, because who did? So they encouraged my writing, which they discovered I could do. And they thought, okay, well, let's push them into journalism, because those guys always work, and they always make a living. So I was encouraged to write about show business for journalism. And when I was at the Ohio State Lantern, the big paper there, I was the editor. I was a movie critic and a theater critic and did all that kind of stuff. And that led me into a degree a dual degree, journalism and theater, which led me to the Chicago Tribune, my first job out of college, where I met Bette Midler, and that was when the professional writing career began.
Now, Bette is known to have said you're the first person to put something in her mouth that made money for both of you.
Yeah. Why, yeah.
How did you end up writing material for her?
Well, she was on Broadway in Fiddler on the Roof, playing one of the daughters, and she used to go down the street to the Improv and sing. And Bud Friedman was ran the Improv, and he became her manager, and he booked her into a club in Chicago called Mr. Kelly's, kind of legendary. And he called me up. I knew him because I used to hang around the Improv in New York, and he said, this girl's coming, who I manage, and would you write a review of her? Would you go see her if you like her, write about her? And the reason he called was, backtracking, about a year before then, he also managed Freddie Prinz. And he had booked Freddie into Mr. Kelly's, and I had gone to see him. He was opening for Jonah Jones, who was a jazz musician. And of course, Jonah Jones' crowd was not interested in Freddie Prinz, who was an 18-year-old Hungarian, Puerto Rican, a Hungarican, he called himself. And they were not having it. And after that, he went back to New York, and he tested for Norman Lear for the series Chico and the Man. And he got it, and he moved out to L.A., and Chico and the Man went on the air, and he became a huge television star. He returned to Mr. Kelly's a year later as a headliner, and he came out and he did the exact same act that he had done a year before, opening for Jonah Jones. And the place went wild, and they gave him a standing ovation. And he came off stage, and I had gotten friendly with him because I'd interviewed him the year before because I thought he was terrific. And he said, "You're the only person here who knows what I did." He said, "I wanted to prove a point to myself that if they are ready to love you, they will love you no matter what you do." And I thought, this is pretty smart for a 19-year-old, being like 22 myself at the time. And it was right. I mean, if they've come to see you, they will accept almost everything that you do. If they don't know who you are, you have to crawl over broken beer bottles to get them to like you. It's one of the first rules of show business. And I wrote that in a column, and Bud said, "Well, you were so good to Freddie Prinz. I want you to see this girl, and if you like this girl, write something, interview her." And so I went to see Bette Midler, who was opening for Jackie Vernon, which was a similar situation. Jackie Vernon, it was an audience of people who looked like Jackie Vernon. He was a deadpan comic, Jackie Vernon. He would come out and he would say things like, "When I was a child, I was unwanted. Now I'm wanted in 13 states. And I was so unwanted that I was run over by a welcome wagon." This was the kind of act he had. And it was pretty funny because it was cumulative. You know, as he kept on doing this, you realized he wasn't stopping. And it was really funny. Of course, his crowd was not the least bit interested in Bette. Bette came out in wearing springalators and tuxedo pants and a blouse with no bra, which she used to say it was a feminist statement. And I said, in your case, it's a terrorist act. And she had the open blouse tied with a sash, the cummerbund, and she came out and she sang Shaboom, her opening, yada yada yada, shaboom, shaboom, and shaking her tits. And the Jackie Vernon crowd kind of went, and nothing she did made them happy. But I thought she was hysterical. And afterwards, I took her out for a drink, and I said, "You're really funny. You should talk more on stage." And she said, "You got any lines?" And I started writing for her at that point. I started writing Chicago stuff for her, local material. And then she went back to New York and got a gig at a Turkish Bath. And she had a hairdresser named Bill Hennessy, who was Mr. Gerard at Bergdorf's. And in his spare time, he wrote material for her, too. And he had something of a breakdown at the Continental Baths. She was playing the Turkish Bath, which is a long story. But one night he came running into the dressing room and he said, "I just saw my shrink in full leather jockstrap." So he had to take a little powder after that. But she was playing the Turkish Bath, and I would go in and I would write stuff for her while she was singing the Turkish Bath.
Well, a lot of time has passed since then. How's that relationship
Only 40
evolved?
years, which is difficult because at the moment she's 32.
How has your relationship with Bet evolved over time?
Well, first of all, how has Bet evolved over time? I mean, she went from being the crazy, edgy. I mean, at the time, she was the wildest thing, and she and Peter Allen were considered very, very wild and crazy, and outre, and then along came Boy George, and Peter said, he makes us look like a nice suburban couple. So at the time, she was on the fringe of mainstream show business, and of course, she became mainstream show business. And she became a big movie star, and in the middle of her career, she suddenly was singing these gigantic ballads that were huge hits. I mean, what I've loved about Bet is that there's a certain edge to her that she never will lose. And even though we just did 2 years in Las Vegas, we did the kind of show that Vegas requires, which is big and brassy, but we still had a whole bunch of dirty stuff in it and a whole bunch of political stuff in it. And so she's never quite lost that. Obviously, she could no longer be 25 years old and looking like they opened Pandora's box and she was at the bottom of it. That was her thing. It's like the last of the truly tacky women. She's now a great lady who lives on Fifth Avenue and has cleaned up New York. But there's something at the core of her that has never changed, which is what people appreciate the minute she hits the stage. I mean, when I work with her now, she's 65 years old at the moment, and there's a whole bunch of people who don't know her history at all. And they come to see her thinking she's going to sing "Wind Beneath My Wings" and "From a Distance" and all this inspirational crap. And they're stunned when she comes out on stage and says, "Hello, fuckers." That guy, I mean, it's just, who's that? Oh, that's Bette Midler. Oh, what do you know?
You talk about working with her.
Yeah.
Is it a very collaborative process?
Yeah, absolutely. Very. I mean, I'll write a whole bunch of stuff, and then she'll get out the blue pencil. And together we will mold it and fix it and change it around. And we've had collaborators over the years. Bill Hennessy, the hairdresser, was our first one, and then Jerry Blatt, who's no longer on the planet, and then Eric Kornfeld, who came in when I started doing Hollywood Squares, and I became a public person, and I couldn't go on the road the way I had before. We needed to bring in another partner, and then I was in Hairspray for 2 years on the road and on Broadway, so I couldn't be with her on tour. So Eric is now in there too.
When did you first come to Los Angeles?
I first came to Los Angeles, and Max Sennett brought me out here because he said, "I need a gay Keystone Cop. They're just all too butch. I need a guy who can really be the caboose, if you catch my drift." And then he went off with Mabel Normand, and they shot up, and that was the last we saw of him. I moved out here in 1975. I had been living in Chicago, writing for the Trib, writing for Bet, and a lot of people, as they would come through Chicago, I would interview, and they would ask me to write for them because I was having this great success with her, and we would hit it off. So I was writing for Lily Tomlin and George Carlin and Joan Rivers and Richard Pryor and David Steinberg and Flip Wilson. I had a list of people who I kind of cultivated in Chicago, and they all were doing television. And I was flying back and forth to L.A. and New York, writing specials for people and being with them when they did the Johnny Carson show and panel stuff, we used to call it. And while that was happening, Bet had a dresser whose brother had started a singing group called the Manhattan Transfer. And we fell in love with them. And we put together their act, and Bet's manager at the time, Aaron Russo, brought Ahmet Ertegun, who ran Atlantic Records, which was Bet's label, and Ahmet signed them to a record deal. And we put this show together, showcased at the Bottom Line, which was a big club in the Village in New York. And Fred Silverman, who at the time was running CBS, he's run every network except PBS. We're waiting for him to run that. When he came, and he was a great believer in variety television, and he sort of fostered the team concept of variety television. Fred came up with Sonny and Cher and Donnie and Marie and Tony Orlando and Dawn, and then Pink Lady and Jeff, and a whole bunch of other things. And in those days, the shows would work during the winter, and then in the summer they would be off the air, and they'd put cheaper original programming in. And a lot of it was variety stuff that was trying out to see if it worked, they'd move it into the fall schedule. And he saw the Manhattan Transfer, which he thought, oh my God, it's a team. And he signed them for a summer series to do 4 shows. And at the time, Cher was doing her own show, and I'd worked on that because Bet had done the pilot of that show. And so I came out, I took a leave of absence in 1975 and came out here to write the Manhattan Transfer summer show. And it was quite a fantastic experience because my co-writer on the show was a guy named Joel Silver. And Joel had worked for a guy named Jack Good. Jack Good produced the occasional variety show, and the Transfer had been guests on a show that Jack produced, which was called Mary Tyler Moore's Incredible Dream. Mary's Incredible Dream. Mary's Incredible Wet Dream, we called it. It was when Mary had her own series, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and it was a special she did. And the Transfer was again, they sang Shaboom, oddly enough. And while they were singing it, bombs went off in the back and all that. And Joel fell in love with them. And when the Transfer got their own summer series, they hired Joel to come on and be one of the writers on the show. So I sat with Joel Silver, who, of course, only wanted to do Follies and Company as movies, and wound up making Die Hard and Action Jackson, and all of it. He did do Brewster's Millions for Richard Pryor. That was a passion project, and Xanadu. That was a passion project. But so that was the crowd, and we were putting together this television series on a shoestring, literally. I mean, when I think about it, our budget was $100,000 a week to put together a gigantic variety show, which we shot at Television City in Hollywood. And I came out here to do that, and we knew we were onto something when the last show we were taping, Carol Burnett was taping across the hall, and I walked onto the Carol Burnett show, and she was doing a parody of Manhattan Transfer with Harvey and Vicky and Tim, and I ran back and I said, "You all got to see this! Carol Burnett's doing us!" Running back, all went running back over to see it, and I thought, that's it. We're the new Smothers Brothers. We're going to be on forever. We're going to rule. And of course, we were on for 4 weeks, and nobody watched. We were opposite 60. Well, we replaced Cher, but we were opposite, like, I don't know, a Disney show or something like that. Nobody watched the thing. But we got great reviews, and heartened by the fact that we got such great reviews, I decided to move here and throw my lot in with Hollywood. And it was the end of the variety show era, so I got in at the very tail end of that, before cable killed variety.
You're here to be a writer, and then somehow you end up playing a dress manufacturer in Mahogany.
That was in Chicago. I was still in Chicago. That was shot in Chicago, yeah. That was because I was a utility player. I would do local commercials. Also, I was on the Trib, and I had become a feature writer, and I was well known, so I was like a Chicago personality. So they would use me in various commercials, and when Mahogany came to town to shoot, because it's about a girl from Chicago who eventually winds up in Rome as a huge fashion model, Diana Ross, and written for Liza Minnelli, interestingly enough, Mahogany. Few people know that. It was a Liza Minnelli vehicle. And she passed. and then suddenly it became about a black girl. Go now. But there was a part in Chicago as a dress designer before she goes to Rome. And there was one woman who was a big casting agent in Chicago, and she said, "You'd be perfect." So I went and I did it. And it was being directed by Tony Richardson, who had won the Oscar for Tom Jones and was a very distinguished director. And at the time was married to Vanessa Redgrave and is the father of Jolie Richardson and Natasha Richardson. And Tony was under the mistaken apprehension he was making a Tony Richardson movie when he was really making a Diana Ross movie. And she had a hard time understanding him because he had one of those very, very poncy English accents. He was like, Diana, I don't understand him here. I don't understand him that way. I don't understand his coming. And she would say, what is he saying? Do you know what he's saying? So they fired him, and Berry Gordy took over. And it was his first film as a director, and maybe his last. He may have done one other after that. And he fired him on the day I was shooting my scene. So I was the first person to actually be directed by him. And we rewrote the scene. In the scene originally, I hired her, and we rewrote it so I didn't hire her. And we have a dialogue written on the table in front of us. And I was sewing, which I don't do. And at one take, I sewed my shirt to her dress. Because she had one of those filmy dresses, and I just took it in my hand and I was sewing it, and she walked away and pulled me off the stool. I'm looking for the outtake. Hello, Paramount. Look in your vault.
While we're looking in the vault,
yes,
and referring to the end of the variety show era, as it were, let's talk about the Paul Lynde Halloween special for a moment.
Wow, well, it's one of my classics. I mean, I have like two or three that I refer to all the time as my classic shows, and that's what, back in the day. Before there was cable, I said cable killed variety, and what I meant by that was variety TV was based on scarcity. If you wanted to see these big stars, you had to make an appointment to tune in to the Ed Sullivan Show, and there were the Beatles. That was the only place you could see the Beatles. That was the only place you could see Elvis. They weren't on 24/7. If you want to see Lady Gaga now, you won't have to wait long. She'll be on one of those 500 stations within the next 3 minutes. And that was not the way it was then. So all of those shows had a great excitement to them because they were where you saw people who you didn't get to see anyplace else. And everybody wanted to do one of those shows so they could be their own Ed Sullivan. They could bring on whoever the hot person of the moment was, or some movie star who they'd always admired. And if you were a television personality and you were big enough, you got to do your own variety show. Depending on what your talents were, if all you did was introduce people, then that's what you did. If you were a comedian, you would be in lots of sketches. If you were a singer, you would be in lots of different numbers. And so Paul Lynde, who was a Hollywood square and was a regular on the Donnie Marie Show, had a gigantic deal at ABC. And he had done a sitcom called The Paul Lynde Show that had one of the biggest opening numbers ever. I mean, rating. It was a huge rating the first week. People hated it. The second week, the rating, it was like a, big old atom bomb. And that was probably because Paul was best taken as a flavor in a recipe. You'd bring Paul in, he would do one line, and kill with that one line, and leave. He was not the central character in a show. And they tried a second time after that with a show called Temperatures Rising, and they put him in as the star and called it The New Temperatures Rising. And again, it didn't work. So Paul had to suffer as a multimillionaire utility player. And one of the things they gave him to make him happy was his own special. But because it was Paul, it just couldn't be the Paul Lynde Show because that was too nonspecific. But marrying Paul Lynde to Halloween was a Fred Silverman idea. He had at that point left CBS and gone to ABC. And he thought those two elements worked well because there's something essentially witchy about Paul Lynde. And he was. We dressed him up as a witch. That was the ad campaign. And we created this world in which we hired famous witches to play his sisters. He was part of a family of witches. And Margaret Hamilton was one of the witches, and Billy Hayes was Witchy Pooh, which was from a Sid and Marty Krofft series, and he was going to visit them, and we loaded it up with guest stars. Tim Conway, who was huge off the Carol Burnett show, Roz Kelly, who played a character on Happy Days called Pinky Tuscadero, which was Fonzie's girlfriend, if you are a Happy Days aficionado, before the shark jumped. She was on it. And Florence Henderson, of course, because she was the star of the Brady Bunch, and she was a big ABC star. And I forget who else we had on it. We probably had somebody I'm leaving out.
Betty White.
Was Betty on it?
Yeah.
Betty White was on it? Oh, Betty White was on it, yeah. I remember Kiss was on it. And that was, they had never been on television before. I mean, it was a gigantic coup to get them on primetime television. They had done the Midnight Special and Don Kirshner's rock concert, but they had never actually been on a TV show. And of course, the great shocker was, Paul had no idea who they were, but the president of their fan club was Ringo Starr's son. And Paul said, "Ringo has a son. I'm going to kill myself." I remember we were shooting the thing on the ABC Prospect lot in Los Feliz, and Roots was on while we were shooting, or it had been on, and we were shooting the thing, and it had been on, I think, for the sweeps or something. I forget what the timing was, but LeVar Burton had starred as Kunta Kinte in Roots, and had exploded. I mean, he was the biggest thing, and he was on the lot doing something, and we were outside having a cigarette break because people still smoked in those days, and Paul and I were out there, we're puffing away, and LeVar Burton comes by, and Paul didn't know his name, but had recognized him from the show and wanted him to know that he knew who he was. And he stood, as he walked by, Paul just pointed at him and went, "Roots!" LeVar Burton. Oh, I forgot to mention Paul was in his full witch drag. The hat, the whole thing. We go to the commissary, everybody was dressed as witches,
So here you are working on the Paul Lynde Halloween special,
Yeah.
terrorizing LeVar Burton. Mm-hmm. And we shift gears a little bit. One of your guest stars was Florence Henderson. How did you meet Florence, and how in the world did you end up working with the Brady Bunch Variety Hour while we're on the demise of the variety show?
I had actually met Florence in New York during her theater period when I was like a show kid. I think I tried out for something, and she was starring in it, and I met her then. And she had come through Chicago when I was a journalist, promoting the Brady Bunch series, and I met her then. I met her as an adult at that point. And when I come to Hollywood and done Manhattan Transfer, Fred Silverman also thought that there was another team, that there was a variety show in The Partridge Family, which of course was about a family that are actually performers. But Shirley Jones was not available, and David Cassidy had left, and the other kids didn't want to do it. But he had this bug in his head to do one of those sitcom things as a variety show, to use them as a team to anchor a variety show. And when The Partridge Family wasn't available, he turned to the Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch had done a couple of things. There were the Brady Kids, and they'd gone out and played state fairs and stuff. So he thought, okay, let's try that. And my agent, my newly minted agent at ICM, said, "There's a Brady Bunch Variety Hour," and I thought, Brady Bunch Variety, it's like the concepts don't work. But I called Florence, who I at that point knew, and I said, the Brady Bunch Variety Hour, and she said, I said, everywhere I go, they say, "You're too hip for this, for variety, you're too hip for television, you're too hip." I'd gone to interview, the Captain and Tennille had a TV series, and they told me I was too hip for the Captain and Tennille. I said, "I'm too hip for the Captain and Tennille, Florence. What do I do?" She said, "I know how you feel." I said, "You too?" She said, "Yes, come write the Brady Bunch. No one will ever say you're too hip again." So I went to do the Brady Bunch Variety Hour, and it was a group of very strange, hip people. Ronnie Graham was directing the sketches, and Carl Kleinschmidt, Steve Bluestein, Terry Hart, all people who went on to have very hip resumes before and after were writing the Brady Bunch Variety Hour, and we had a fabulous time doing it. We were chemically altered much of the time. It was the 70s. But that was how I got to know her. Also, we had written this fabulous thing on the Paul Lynde Halloween show for Florence that got cut. Barbara Walters had been hired as the first female news anchor. She was co-anchoring with Harry Reasoner, and they were doing the ABC Evening News at the time. And we did a sketch with Florence and Paul Lynde as Barbara Walters and Harry Reasoner. And of course, at the time, the joke was Harry Reasoner hated Barbara Walters and did everything he could to sabotage her. And he was sort of a misanthrope to begin with, Harry Reasoner. That was his personality. And so Paul played that wonderfully. He was, she would be very perky and authoritative, and he would go, "That's fascinating, Barbara." And it was a very funny sketch, and we shot it. And Fred Silverman said, "You can't do it because it's too soon." He said he didn't want to piss Barbara Walters off, and he didn't want, I think, to acknowledge that this experiment was not working, and to have it made fun of on his own network. So it's in a vault somewhere, and it was really funny, and Florence loved it, and that was partially how I got to work on the Variety Hour.
Was there any particular challenge in writing musical numbers out of the public domain library for that show?
No, because they were old, and they were all Sousa marches. What was in the public domain back then? Yeah. Now a lot of stuff is in the public domain because time marches on. When Alexander's Ragtime Band went into the public domain, I think it's what killed Irving Berlin. He was 105 years old, but I think at the same time he realized he wasn't going to get any more money off Alexander's Ragtime Band. He said, "That's it, I'm checking out."
Did the themes for all of the musical medleys on that show all had particular themes? Did those come out of the writer's room?
Yes, the themes did come out of the writers' room, but Sid and Marty Krofft were producing it. So, and then they're big theme queens. They always had balloons. This week it's balloons. In fact, we all got little Christmas presents from them. That it was a glass. It was a painting, a frame. But it was with glass over it, and behind it there was confetti and a balloon and sparklers. And printed across the bottom it said, "In case of finale, break glass." Because every finale was balloons, sparklers, confetti, balloons, sparklers, confetti. And sometimes they would be the theme. The theme would be confetti. The theme would be Broadway musicals, kind of like American Idol now does. It's Motown week. Or it's Country Music Week, I forget what themes. It's circus. That was always a good one.
There was one theme I recall, dancing.
Plain old dancing
was the theme of, and every song had something to do with dancing in it. And there's actually a moment that made it to air with Chris Knight on a platform that is shaking wildly as he's attempting to dance on it, with a giant star behind him that looks like it was crafted in a glitter glass.
Yeah.
Also swinging, and him looking terrified. I know that for some of the kids on the show, dancing, and for Bob Reed too, was a challenge.
Yes.
What were some of the particular challenges of that show?
Well, first of all, my basic joke about it was 7 Tennille's and 1 captain. Or 7, it was 7, I said that wrong. It was 7 captains and 1 Tennille. Florence was the only one who really could sing or dance. The others kind of got away with it. Barry Williams is much better now than he was then. Ambi Davis was terrific. She could cut a rug. But the others were just not, they were professional kids, but they weren't Mama Rose's Toreadorables. They didn't have any of that stuff. So they were being asked to do stuff that was not really in their wheelhouse. So that was a number one challenge. Number two was that it was a rank imitation of Donnie and Marie. They had ice skaters, we had water ballet, and everything was being done on a shoestring. Not a terrible shoestring. I mean, Sid and Marty would come in, and Sid would say, "I see 36 mermaids," and Marty would say 18 mermaids. It was like that. So that was a challenge. We also had big guest stars. They had to be served every week. We had Donnie and Marie were on the pilot. We had Farrah Fawcett and Lee Majors, who were married at the time. We had some brilliant ones: Vincent Price, Tony Randall. We brought in Rip Taylor as a love interest for Ann B. Davis. That was fabulous because they loathed each other on site. But the challenges basically were that we had this ridiculous premise that the Brady Bunch had moved to Hollywood and gotten a variety show. They were living in a house in Malibu, which had a gigantic pool in the back, where water ballet was staged all the time. And they had all these guest star friends. You know how Jack Benny used to have, I'm going down the street to see if Marilyn Monroe wants to do the show. Well, it was that kind of thing, So we'd have Tina Turner, who would just run away from Ike, and was doing all these gigs, on her own. I remember she came on the show, and she went over to Pete Menefee, who was the wardrobe guy. She was wearing some dress that they'd given her. It was like an Ike and Tina dress, because she had none of her own clothes anymore, because Ike had taken everything. So he had to get her a Tina Turner dress. And she came over to me and she said, where's the costume designer? And I pointed over there, and she said, would you tell him that the last person who wore this dress had very high armpits, and I need these armpit things to be cut a little bit? So she knew right away they hadn't built this thing for her. And of course the last person who had worn the thing was Robert Reed. It was in some dress. We always put him in a dress if we could, because that was the only way we could guarantee that he would get a big laugh. Robert and Carmen Miranda drag was about as funny as it got.
And you had the whole fake Jan debacle to deal with.
We did, yes, exactly. Although, I was never a Brady Bunch rabid aficionado, so I didn't realize that there were people at the time who were totally into it. What had happened was an actress named Eve Plum had stepped out of the Brady Bunch into a movie called Dawn, Portrait of a Teenage Runaway. And she'd gotten a 40 share, which in those days was gigantic. Now it's phenomenal. I mean, if you get a 40 share now, they give you Dubai as a gift. I mean, in those days it was big, but it wasn't as big as it would be now. But we called her Eve, I have a 40 share Plum. And Dawn, Portrait of a Teenage Runaway, begat Alexander, The Other Side of Dawn, which was about Lee McCluskey as a boy who runs away to Hollywood and becomes a hooker. And Frances Faye was in that one. Just a little side trip. But Eve was now a serious dramatic actress, and she was not going to be Jan Brady anymore. And so when they made this deal to go back to the Brady Bunch for the Variety Hour, she wouldn't come back, so we had to find a new Jan. And it came down to two girls, one a girl named Jerry Reichel, who got the part, and the other one was a girl who didn't get the part, and she wound up marrying one of the Hilton heirs and became Kathy Hilton and had two children named Paris and Nicole, who they named Nicky Hilton after her great uncle Nicky, who was married to Elizabeth Taylor, her first husband. Doesn't it get incredibly bizarre? So, and Zsa Zsa's in there somewhere too. So Kathy Hilton didn't get the part, Jerry Reichel got the part, and people who were Brady Bunch fanatics immediately dubbed her Fake Jan, because the real Jan, Eve Plum, was not on the show. So we had the stigma of Fake Jan hanging over our heads besides. And it wasn't like, Jerry Reichel had been a breakout star, but she wasn't. She was a pleasant girl who looked like Eve Plum, kind of. And so I didn't know until years later that Fake Jan had meant anything. But there are people who would come up to me later and say, "You did that show with Fake Jan." I was trying to remember which of the many Jans were they talking about.
You had Fake Jan, but you had real Sid and Marty.
Yeah.
Sid and Marty of the adult puppet set.
Well.
What was that like? Everything they touched was psychedelic,
Yeah.
except the Brady Bunch Variety Hour.
Well, they tried. I mean, it wasn't psychedelic. It was surrealistic. I mean, there were this family living at the beach with this pool and all these strange guest stars. I mean, we had the episode where the oldest kid, Greg, ran away to live with Vincent Price. This was kind of surrealistic, but it wasn't pure psychedelic. It wasn't like Lidsville, I mean, that was Sid putting over a really fabulous joke on everybody by integrating his own psychedelic experiences into children's television. Children's television is kind of crazy and psychedelic and weird to begin with. So it sort of, made sense because everything is pinwheels and confetti, and that is Sid's world.
And now
But in the Brady Bunch, they weren't allowed to go as far as they could with the other stuff.
compare and contrast that to another show that was shooting right there, Donnie and Marie.
Well, I actually wound up going from the Brady Bunch to Donnie and Marie because I hadn't started with Donnie and Marie, but it was Sid and Marty had started Donnie and Marie, and then they had gone to the Brady Bunch, and then in the interim, pardon me, they were fired by Donnie and Marie. And they weren't fired in the grand sense of, you're out of here. It was the Osmonds decided they could save some money by producing the show themselves. Once they had learned how to produce the show, which they did by watching Sid and Marty, they took it over and decided they were going to produce it. And eventually, they moved it to Utah, which was the death knell of the show. Excuse me. But one of the things they did after they took over was Marie was turning 18. And they decided they were going to adult her up. They were going to make her into a glamorous young woman as opposed to the kid's sister. And I was part of the squad that came in to make her an adult young woman. Bob Mackey was also on the squad. They hired him to design all of her costumes. And I remember that we opened the show with her singing, "I'm coming out," which I thought was hysterical. I was the only one who, all the gay people were laughing at the thing. But the Osmonds had no idea what we were laughing about. But I was brought on to make it more adult. And one of the things, I was constantly at odds with them because they wanted her to be adult, but they didn't want her to be an adult. They wanted her to be a Mormon adult. And this was 1976, so the Mormons weren't even as loose as they are today, if loose is a word that you can use in conjunction with Mormons. I mean, you couldn't mention coffee on the Donnie and Marie show because they didn't believe in anything caffeinated. So there would be milk breaks. Nobody ever could say, "Could I have a cup of coffee?" because it was unheard of. And one of the things that I did, I was getting her, looking for material for songs for her to do. And Carol Bayer Sager and Melissa Manchester, who were good friends of mine, had written a song called "Comin' from the Rain." It's a beautiful song about a lover taking back somebody who's left. And Marie loved the song. She just thought it was phenomenal. And it is phenomenal. And the Mormon elders, everything went to Salt Lake City for the Mormon elders to review because Donnie and Marie were such high-profile Mormons that they didn't want anything to happen by mistake. So the network censor had nothing to do on the show. The network censor would count the disco ball, the lights, because it was when you flash disco lights at a certain rhythm, it sends epileptics into seizures. So her job would be to count the beats. But that's all she had to do because the Mormon elders had vetted everything else. So the Mormon elders came back and said she can't sing the song because the lyric, it's about a woman whose husband has left her. Where they got this from, I don't know. She never sings about her husband. But this is, like husbands don't leave Mormon wives. So this is a concept Marie cannot sing. And we went round and round about this, and they said absolutely not, she can't sing it at all. And she was really pissed off. And so I said, we'll find something else. And I gave her, Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, which was Elton John. And they loved Elton John. They said, oh, that Elton John, he's so peppy, we like him. And it never occurred to them that there was any double entendre there. And, of course, I sat in the booth watching Marie sing, Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, with a network censor who was sitting there just kind of going. So that was my prime experience with the Osmonds.
What was the reason for the cancellation of that show? Was it ratings?
Yeah, sure. They moved the show to Utah. They built a studio, a big white elephant, which now probably makes money because they do Lifetime movies there. But it was the show lasted a year once they got to Provo, Utah. It was very difficult to shoot it in Utah. There was no infrastructure. If you needed a palm tree for the Hawaiian number, there were no palm trees in Utah. You had to go fly one in from Hollywood. So they were flying everything in, and writers, dancers, everything was being flown in. So it was costing them a lot of money to do the show. And they, in their effort, because teen legends have a short lifespan. Are you listening, Justin Bieber? Donnie had already faded away, and Sean Cassidy was the hot new thing. So they didn't call the show Donnie Marie. They called it the Osmond Family Hour, which sounded incredibly Mormon, like they should give you green Jello while you're watching the show. And the double whammy was CBS put on The Incredible Hulk opposite the show. The Incredible Hulk exploded. It was a gigantic success. And the combined shift in format and raised expense level of the show conspired to kill it. And so they limped through a season, and then that was it. They were done.
Were you there with it the last season?
Yes, but I was, in an effort to save money, everybody was in a room in L.A. on the speakerphone, and once a week, one of us would fly up to be actually on hand when they shot the thing. So I said that was fine because I'd spent as much time in Utah as I wanted. I mean, the first time I went up there, I was in a hotel with Paul Lynde, and Paul was not popular in Utah. Paul closed every gay bar in Utah, both of them. He actually got them shut down. He was arrested several times for various drunken things, and the Osmo Fuzz had to go bail him out and all of that, he would. I mean, I'd sat in the motel where we were staying, and at 4 a.m, Paul would be pounding on the door saying, "Come with me, let's get some dick." It was not not what they do in Utah. So I didn't spend that much time there. That was okay. That was fine.
But being based in Los Angeles while the show was in Utah certainly afforded you an opportunity for what I'm sure is one of your favorite highlights of your career, the Star Wars Holiday Special.
Yes, God, you're hitting all my great lights, all my great moments.
What was that show?
That was Star Wars was a huge hit in 1977, and back in the day there were the 3 networks, and if you wanted maximum exposure, you went on one of them. And George Lucas was shooting The Empire Strikes Back, and he, I think, was a little skittish about the brand. The Star Wars brand hadn't really set in yet. So he wanted to ensure that the public remembered Star Wars when the sequel came back. Because you have to remember that this was early in the blockbuster movie syndrome. The first blockbuster was Jaws in '74, something like that. And so they were in the business of figuring out how to make these tentpole movies. Now, the Harry Potter and Transformers and all these things. This was the beginning of all that. So one way to ensure that people remembered it was to do a big television show built around the Star Wars brand. And he had 7 or 10, I think he said. He had 10 stories he'd fleshed out, and he intended on filming 6 of them, which he did. It took him 30 years to film the 6, but he eventually did film 6. And the other 3 he sold off to other things. One became a novel, one became a comic book series. And this last one that he had, he decided to turn into a television special. But I think in his mind it was going to be like a Star Wars movie, but there was more money to be made in a big variety show because there was something so bizarre about the idea of doing Star Wars with variety. So he sold this to CBS, and unfortunately, the central characters in this story were the Wookiees. And the Wookiees look kind of like me, and they don't speak any discernible language. They sound like fat people having orgasms. It's like, trust me, I know. And that would be like, that's "Hi, honey, I'm home." So we had to have people with them at all times to translate what they were saying. And so we had like Art Carney as an intergalactic traveling salesman trying to sell Mrs. Chewbacca appliances. And it was all about, he was establishing the plot. "Hi, where's Chewie?" "Oh, really? He's in the Y-wing fighter." "Oh, and the troopers are following him." "Yes, we hope he gets home safely." And the idea of the story was that there's a holiday called Life Day, which George had invented, and I think he hoped it would catch on like Festivus. And Chewbacca had to get back to the Wookiee planet to celebrate Life Day. So Chewbacca was in the Millennium Falcon with Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Princess Leia. And they were trying to get him home for Life Day while avoiding Imperial troopers who were on their tail. And so one day was spent shooting with all of them, and those scenes were interspersed through the thing. And the rest of it was on the planet, on the Wookiee planet, at the Wookiee home. And they had a lovely treehouse where they lived. And there was Mrs. Chewbacca, and there was Grandpa Wookiee, and there was a little kid, a little kid Wookiee. And they all lived together and all to each other for hours. And we had devices to get us out of their home. There was like a helmet thing that you put on, and it went into the Wookiee brain and projected fantasies in like a glass globe, which we would then come in on, and we would see whatever the fantasy was. And the grandfather had a fantasy of Diane Carroll, of all things, in a Bob Mackie gown, singing something. And that was supposed to be Cher, but she turned it down. And a whole list of people turned it down. Diane wanted to do it. The little kid had a fantasy of Jefferson Starship. And so we had them singing. And he had a later fantasy of Cirque du Soleil, which was just starting out. And we had them. And then there was also, of course, a television set that Mrs. Chewbacca watched. She watched a cooking show. And we had Harvey Korman as Julia Child, as an alien Julia Child who had 8 arms. And so, you tell you, first we're going to make leek soup. First, take a leak. Oh! And then on the way to the planet, they stopped on Tatooine. And Tatooine, as Star Wars fanatics will tell you, is where the traders all meet at the cantina.
And we're going to stop at the cantina and change